chapter 23 is very similar to chapter 16. Both of them are long, extended metaphors of Israel or Judah as a prostitute. There is a slightly different emphasis, so let me simply stress that for you as you read 23 and as you read 16. They are both extended, as I said, metaphors dealing with 16 more with an emphasis on the religious, spiritual adultery of Israel. Okay? Whereas 23, the emphasis is more on Israel's political adultery. That is, in the sense that she sought security in political alliances with different foreign powers. Now, that obviously has religious implications. You cannot just totally put a knife down between the two, and they're absolutely totally separate. They're not. In fact, the religious adultery and prostitution is because of relationships politically. So, but the emphasis in 16 is more on the religious aspect of spiritual adultery. 23 more on the political adultery of seeking security in various connections and alliances and relationships. To seek security from anyone but God is a vain thing to do. It's empty. Our security is not in man, but in God. As good as your friends and everything may be, they are human beings, and somewhere along the line, they will fail you. They will disappoint you. If for no other reason, our dependency should be, and it should be for more than that, should be upon God. Now, chapter 23 will talk about the common origin. It's going to talk about it's going to talk about the two sisters, really, at this point. It's going to talk about the older sister, Samaria, and it's going to talk about the younger sister, Judah. The older sister's name is Oholah, which means her tent, and the younger sister's name is Oholibah, which is my tent is in her. I think we can probably come up with some better concepts of how that might relate for Judah than we can for Samaria. Her tent. Okay, good. Glad she's got one. But apart from that, it's a little difficult to think of, well, does that have any particular meaning? Why did he use that name? If you come up with some good ideas, I'm all ears to hear them. My tent is in her. Certainly we can see if God's tent, his tabernacle, which is often at times called the tent of meeting, is in the midst of her, and it is. It's in Jerusalem, and Jerusalem has been the focus. So certainly we could see something more feasible in the significance and the meaning of that name, though interestingly, neither one of them are given in other words, it doesn't say this means X. It's best not to make explicit interpretations in an allegory where the text and the context fail to delimit a meaning. You may accuse me of being too conservative, but that's the way I am. I just think if I do not have explicit context and explicit statements or something in the meaning within the text, I need to be careful about making any explicit interpretations. Verses 5 to 10 will speak of Samaria's prostitution, and what it will simply say is that she is gone and she has been unfaithful to Yahweh by seeking up security in the relationship and the strength of other nations, predominantly Assyria. And God will, as a verdict upon her, give her into the hands of the Assyrians to judge her. And of course, we know that's exactly what happened. 23 to 35, we find the focus is upon the prostitution of Jerusalem. And they did not learn from Samaria's experience. And so they engaged in more lustful and corrupt fornication than Samaria. And these verses will talk about how they have sought different lovers, keeping the metaphor of whether it be Assyria first and then Babylon. And then they even have sought lovers in Egypt. They've sought security from these different relationships that they have had. And it appears even in part, as you will read through this, that Jerusalem realized in her error in part after becoming a vassal of Babylon, how this didn't provide a whole lot of security on their part, and they turned away to Egypt as a result to seek security. So they they tried to find security. They entered into an adulterous relation in that sense with Babylon, only to realize that it was not a good relationship. So then they turned to an adulterous relationship with Egypt. All the way along, they should be turning to Yahweh for the security in life. And the verdict will be given here also that Babylon, one of her lovers, in that sense, will execute God's judgment upon her in that case. Verses 28 to 31 are actually a second message, but they are repetitious of the first and have the same sort of a concept. And the final verses of the chapter come back that Samaria, the cup that Samaria drank, cup of judgment, Jerusalem must drink also. The wrath of God that will come, there will be ridicule, mocking, and she will be devastated. Judgment for prostitution is mentioned all the way along, but it's highlighted in verses 36 to 49, where he would go through again, even as we saw back in 16, and that's not why I'm spending a lot of time here, because of the similarities. But because of the defilement that they've done, because of their adulterous relationship, as we read in verse 43, it says, they were worn out by adultery. Boy, isn't that a statement? They just wore them out. It's engaged in so much adultery, they're just pooped, in this whole thing. It was so despicable. And so judgment for an adulteress and a murderer of the Mosaic covenant is executed upon them, which is death, normally by stoning. Now the purpose of God in the very last verses, 48, 49, is that it will bring an end to the wickedness in the promised land. It will be that which will instruct other nations, and by the metaphor other women, other nations, not to follow the same, and they will bear the punishment for their sin. That will be the results of the discipline that will come upon them. Mm-hmm.
Dr. Alexander, how would you respond to liberals, particularly feminist exegetes who say that Ezekiel is a misogynist?
I guess I've been away too long. Tell me what a misogynist is.
A misogynist is a man who hates women.
Okay. Well, I really don't think you can argue that from here. Most of this has been against men throughout the whole book. So they got the worst end of the deal. So actually, I think I'd rather be a woman at that point. In this, that nations are referred to in the sense of feminine is historical. You can take almost any language. Nations are referred to as she's. Why? I don't know. Yeah, but that's true in so many languages and so forth. So I think, frankly, the argument is just somebody's trying to pick a fight at that point and has a chip on their shoulder about that. I mean, children get it in Ezekiel as well as the women get it and the men get it. I would have a hard time seeing the validity of that. Chapter 24. Chapter 24 is the pivot chapter of the book. It's in chapter 24 that we see Jerusalem's judgment and the actual, in essence, the fall of Jerusalem. The key to the parable that we'll have of the cooking pot and so forth is in verse 2. Son of man, record this date, this very date, because the king of Babylon has laid siege to Jerusalem this very day. It's in the 9th year, the 10th month, on the 10th day. This is taking place on this very time, 2 years and 5 months since the last series of messages, and taking place, depending on your minor calendrical problems, within the December-January period of 589, 588 BC. The exact date within, depending upon the particular system, can be given then at that point. But he is to record this. This is a permanent, this is a very important thing for Ezekiel, because he's speaking to the exiles again who said this would never happen. They just couldn't bring themselves to think that the third deportation or the job would be finished as far as the judgment, that really Jerusalem would be destroyed and the people would be dispersed completely among the nations, though there was, of course, those ones that were left, that small group left in the land of Canaan, and Jeremiah was left there with them, and they ultimately send him away to Egypt. So I think this is very crucial, in a sense, key in our understanding of what's going on. This is the events of the beginning of the siege of Jerusalem. It's now on this very day happens. And this parable is given in light of the siege, where he says, put on the cooking pot, put it on, pour water into it, put into it pieces of meat, all the choicest pieces, the leg, the shoulder, fill it with the best of these bones. Take the pick of the flock, pile the wood beneath it for the bones, and pile the wood beneath it for the bones, bring it to a boil, and cook the bones in it. Okay? So, I don't think that takes a lot of explaining, at least as far as the figure. You got a cooking pot, and you put these choice pieces of meat in it, and you cook it until the bones cook in it, so forth. Now, what does this mean for us? Well, we have our first speech that's then given in verse 6 that is describing for us, woe to the city of bloodshed, to the pot now encrusted. So the pot is the city, okay? The city of bloodshed, okay? Whose deposit will not go away. Empty it piece by piece, without casting lots for it. For the blood she shed is in her midst. She poured it on the bare rock. She did not pour it on the ground, where the dust would cover it. To stir up wrath and take vengeance, I put her blood on the bare rock, so that it would not be covered. Therefore, this is what Adonai Yahweh says, woe to the city of bloodshed. I, too, will pile the wood high. So heap on the wood and kindle the fire. Cook the meat well, mixing in the spices, and let the bones be charred. Then set the empty pot on the coals until it becomes hot, and its copper glows, so its impurities may be melted, and its deposits burned away. It has frustrated all efforts. Its heavy deposit has not been removed, not even by fire. Now this is what's going to happen to the siege. The city of Jerusalem is the pot once again. This is a little different use of the imagery than we had earlier. And the pieces of meat in the midst of this are, in essence, the choice members of the flock, the choice pieces. Okay? He says it's the members of the flock. Flock is used frequently to refer to the people of God, the people of Israel. And so the pot is Jerusalem. The context is the siege. Pieces of meat, representing in that sense the inhabitants, the choice people. It will be boiled in judgment, and till all you have left are charred bones. And then you stick it back on there again and get rid of everything so that you can burn all the impurities out of the pot. This is in the sense of the cleansing and the purifying of the nation. So it's a very vivid description, because it still had blood in it from the violent bloodshed of the city, which we've seen that phrase over and over and over again. And so they did not even pour out the blood and cover it like they were supposed to do in the Mosaic Covenant. They put it out as if it were on a bare rock, uncovered. And God is going to come and cleanse the cities. He's going to come and purify the pot until it gets red hot. It glows. Have any of you ever seen a pot glow, metal pot glow? Yeah, you better stay away from it when it's like that. But this is the picture. And so it's the judgment upon the inhabitants. It's judgment on Jerusalem, the pot, the inhabitants inside, and he's going to also purify the city. Now, he does say here that the deposits will not go away, empty it piece by piece without casting lots for them, in verse 6. Now, in that particular situation, he's going to remove pieces, because some we do know are going to go into dispersion. Many will die. But there will be no favoritism here. The lot will not fall on anyone to receive special favor at this point to be removed from this judgment. The pieces will be removed without any favoritism at all. There will be no casting of lots for them. Oh, okay, we get that one. We'll take that one. Oh, we're going to take that. No. What will be done in God's sovereign working. Those that will go into dispersion will be His work. There will be, in a sense, nobody has any rights or reasons to be favored. Yes.
I'm just wondering, the picture of blood being poured out, not on the ground but on the bare rocks. Is that just to signify their public sins that were shown? The murders they created were not covered up; they were made public throughout their history. Or what does that signify?
I think it's the bloodshed of the people that's taken place within the city, as he's mentioned several times within the book. So taking it contextually within the book, and it was done indiscriminately. They didn't even cover the blood. They didn't even carry out the Mosaic covenant concepts of the purity that they should have done when the blood is shed. They have disregarded in every aspect the ways of God and what He does. And certainly we see that here very clearly. Verse 13, now your impurity is lewdness, because I've tried to cleanse you, but you would not be cleansed from your impurity. You would not be clean until my wrath against you has subsided. So even the pot even though it's red hot, and it says in verse 11 that the impurities may be melted and its deposits burned away. It's frustrated all efforts. Its heavy deposit has not been removed, not even by fire. So the implication is, though there is a purifying that takes place by the burning and the fall of Jerusalem, it's still not finished. It's not finished. There's still corruption. And that's why he says, I tried to clean you in verse 13. You would not be cleansed from your impurity. You will not be clean again until my wrath against you has subsided. And we already know that wrath, it goes at least through the Babylonian captivity. And we've had indications that it goes all the way until they're restored again, as far as a people. Verse 14, I, Yahweh, have spoken. The time has come for me to act. I will not hold back. I will not have pity, nor will I relent. You will be judged according to your conduct and your actions, declares Adonai Yahweh. You ever notice in Scripture that judgment is not based on what one says? It's based on what one does. Our life, what we do, manifests what we believe and what's on the inside. We come to Christ by faith on the inside, decision of faith. It should be visible and manifested, and therefore the judgment is done on the basis of what one does. Something to think about, the process. Okay, as we come to verse 15, we have sign that is given to the exiles, a very sad sign. The word of the Lord came to me, Son of man, with one blow I am about to take away from you the delight of your eyes. Do not lament or weep or shed any tears. Groan quietly. Do not mourn for the dead. Keep your turban fastened and your sandals on your feet. Do not cover the lower part of your face or eat the customary food of mourners. He is saying to Ezekiel, the delight of your eyes, your wife is going to die in a single blow. The Hebrew term for blow here is at times used to refer to plagues or to diseases. What exactly was the situation? Doesn't mean that it was one of those. We don't know. That's not the point of the text. She was the delight of Ezekiel's eyes. That's important in that phrase. As you know, ancient Near Eastern funeral rites, when one dies, as we already implied, one mourns after the death, and there's professional mourners, there's weeping, there's wailing, there's sackcloth, there's ashes, and so forth. All that go on. He is not to mourn at all in those normal ways, not even a tear. Okay? He is just to groan rather quietly, just to groan. Now, we read in verse 18 that he shared the message in the next morning. He said, I spoke to the people in the morning, and in the evening my wife died. The next morning I did as I had been commanded. Then the people asked me, won't you tell us what these things have to do with us? So I said to them, the word of the Lord came to me, say to the house of Israel, this is what Adonai Yahweh says, I am about to desecrate my sanctuary, the stronghold in which you take pride, the delight of your eyes. See? I took away the delight of Ezekiel's eyes, his wife. To you, your delight is the temple. That's what you pride yourself in at this point. He says, I'm going to desecrate it. It is what you take pride, the light of your eyes, the object of your affection. The sons and daughters you left behind will fall by the sword. And you will do as I have done. When your relatives, your loved ones die, when the temple has fallen, you will do what I have done. I'm a model for you. I'm a picture of how you are to respond. He said, you will not cover the lower part of your face or eat the customary food of mourners. You will keep your turbans on your heads and your sandals on your feet. You will not mourn or weep, but be wasted away because of your sins and groan among yourselves. Ezekiel will be a sign to you. A sign to you. You will do just as he has done. And when this happens, you will know that I am Adonai Yahweh. So they are not to mourn. You say, why not? Because it shouldn't be a surprise, folks. Surprised Ezekiel. Happened quickly. They've been being told now, even just by Ezekiel, for how many years? At least 4 years. And they've been being told by other prophets. It should not be a surprise. They've heard, they've been told. So, no need to weep. You knew it was coming. It's happened all the way along. Verse 25, and you, son of man, on the day that I take away their stronghold, their joy and glory and the delight of their eyes, their heart's desire, and the sons and daughters as well, on that day a fugitive will come to tell you the news. That is, on the day that Jerusalem falls. So this fugitive is going to come from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv by the river Kibar in Babylon to give the message. Mm-hmm.
I was wondering, it says in verse 21, it was the delight of your eyes, speaking of the people, yet the people clearly profaned God's temple. Mm-hmm. So how could it be a delight to their eyes?
The building and all of its glory. It was not the delight in the way it should be, but it was to them the center, kind of the representative of, it was kind of the representation of their nation. And though it's one thing, to mistreat it, it's another thing when suddenly it's gone. So it was important to them. It was the thing that was most significant to them as a people, though they abused it and misused it and desecrated it and defiled it. But they thought they were doing things okay when they did that. But this was their building. They had lost. They had forgotten Yahweh. They had forgotten. So the interest has come now more on the building rather than on the one whom the building visually is to represent his presence. I hope that doesn't happen to us in our buildings. One thing that strikes me, I just might say in passing, which I think has some parallel. When I go to Israel and I see all of the Crusader castles and churches, and they're empty. Nothing there. All it is a building. And I think, that's all the legacy they had. If you know anything about the Crusaders.
Jeremiah, God told Jeremiah to tell him, don't trust in deceptive words. This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord. They continued to
do that.
Look to that as being some symbol of
it was a religious thing. It was a very important building to them. It was a glorious building. The Solomonic Temple, from all we can tell from all the descriptions, was a glorious building. In fact, as I said, when you come back in the restoration, that's the thing in Haggai, that the elder people come back, they mourn the fact that the glory of the temple doesn't compare to what it was in Solomon's time. That was so, the building was so significant to them. Mm-hmm.
How long was the siege, the final siege, to destroy Jerusalem?
The siege was about 13 months, if I remember correctly. Let me check that for certain.
Is there any record in Jeremiah of any last-minute kind of revival attempts that having the city surrounded by the Babylonians and over a year and siege and terrible things happening, it would seem to me that the people would finally kind of get it and start calling out to Yahweh and say, you know what, we're really wrong. Please rescue us. Is there any record of that?
No.
Didn't some of the Jews actually set fire to the stores food in the temple, assuming that...
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Didn't some of the Jews, actually, the zealots, actually set fires to the stores of food in the temple, assuming that the sooner they can utterly... They just assumed God would intervene, but they're almost speaking of process. Is there any...
Of course, questions about that in the destruction in 70 A.D., but I'm not, of course... Yeah, not at this time, yeah.
In Jeremiah, aren't there false prophets who are saying, we're going to win?
Oh yeah, there's false prophets everywhere saying they're going to win, peace. I mean, we've already seen that, here. I mean, that Jeremiah talks about them also. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, you would say. I mean, I hope we've seen it all the way along. We hope you'd say, why not before now? But even at the end, no, nothing. But at this point with Ezekiel, notice the last part of what he says here. Okay. And you, son of man, the day that I take away their stronghold, their joy, and the delight of their eyes, and their heart's desire, and their sons and daughters, on that day the fugitive will come to tell you the news. So he's taken off, and we're going to see later it takes about 3 months for him. At that time, your mouth will be opened. Okay? So he has been mute through the whole announcement of judgment and the reason for it. It's been predominantly by acts, except by messages that God has told him to give with no interaction. Okay? Just message. Guys are always sitting in his house. They're always there watching. They're obviously curious, at least what is he going to do next type of thing. The curiosity probably kept them coming to hear the message. But he did not carry on the normal prophetic function of moving among the people, interceding for them, and making proclamations. But now, when the person comes, his mouth will be open, and you will speak with him, and will no longer be silent. So you will be assigned to them, and they will know that I am Yahweh. Now he told them back at the beginning, you're going to be mute until the judgment comes. And he's going to be mute there in Babylon until the night right before the fugitive comes. And that's when chapter 33:21 through 39, in the night, 6 messages are given of hope to the people before they hear the news that Jerusalem's fallen. Isn't that like God? Encourages them before they hear the bad news. He didn't have to do that. But he delights to encourage. Because at that point, when they hear the news, their hearts are just going to sink. Everything they've been arguing for, everything they've been denying that has been announced will have happened. And they will be devastated, were it not for the positive message of hope that Ezekiel's going to give just immediately before they hear that news, so that they can have hope. God's so loving and gracious in what he does. And God does those kind of things with us also. Now, in the aspect of the whole, we come next section in Ezekiel to the judgment on the foreign nations. Now, and this is going to take us from 29:17, from 25:1 through 33:20. We'll talk about 29:17 to 30:19, which is dated at a different time. Otherwise, we have a date for these messages, the initial ones in 25, 24 and 25 are the same dated message. Now I say that because I think that has some significance. Ezekiel is going to put the book together thematically and predominantly chronologically. We tend to break things up and separate and say, oh, we finished now with Judah, let's now talk about the foreign nations. Ezekiel doesn't tend to do that. He says this is the continuation of talking about the judgment of God. We've talked about Judah and we're going to talk about the nations. It's not like, well, there's Judah now, let's stop and let's go over here and talk about the nations irrelated to Judah. No, you can't do that because they're related one to the other. So we see that the date for 24 and chapter 25 is the same. Now we're going to have other dates within the foreign nation where he's compiled. Ezekiel is put together primarily chronologically because all these things are happening. Look right up there in 87 to 85, 587 to 585. And what are all those chapters? You got 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32. They're all boom, 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 boom. And they're all talking about what? The foreign nations. Because during and immediately following the collapse of Jerusalem, God is talking about, well, okay, the nations are involved in this situation also. And we need to know that, and you, Judah, need to know that. As you enter into this, what is God's perspective? Is he being faithful to what he has also said about the nations at this point? Yes, he is. 24 and 25 have to do, are right at this time immediately at the specific collapse, the beginning of the siege, because in 25 we have the nations who are immediately surrounding them, the nations like Ammon, Moab, Edom, Philistia, and so forth, immediately around them. And then we move further away to Tyre, and then we move to Egypt. And those are the nations that are dealt with. Now, the basic announcements of judgments for the foreign nations are going to be primarily the longer extended statements are going to be on Tyre and on Egypt. And Egypt gets the most in this. Nothing about Babylon. Okay? The others only get a little bit at this time, but they're here thematically put together against them all, though they're delivered at different times. They are topically formed into a single unit, but please don't remove that unit from its context, and in part Ezekiel has helped us not to do that by putting 24 and 25 in the same chronological date. He holds, no, you got to keep this related to the situation of Judah. Mm-hmm.
In the prophetic writings from Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel to the 12th, there are these sections that are polemics against other nations, polemics against the Gentiles. Mm-hmm. Why is that? Why is that a part of prophetic literature, that there are all these stinging rebukes on the Gentiles?
Because heathenism will never triumph over God's revelation in his people. And he wants them to see that the message that they are to be number one, they are to be a blessing to the world, but how the world responds, remember back in the Abrahamic covenant, those who bless you, I will bless, plural by the way, and by the way, the plural means that's where God's emphasis is, but the one who curses you, I will curse, okay, which is the singular. And he wants them to know that if that's still true, and if you respond positively to the message, you will be blessed. But if you don't, there will be judgment and discipline upon you as well. And so he doesn't dismiss them. He talks about that also because it's part of his faithfulness. It's part of his working in the prophets. So judgment, it's not like Israel's out here as an isolated entity from the rest of the world. All the rest of these people that are, how are they responding to God's people, even in the bad times? How are they responding to them? What are they doing? And so God speaks to them also. Plus, as we'll see, and we've already gotten the glimpses of this, God has his purposes for them also in his sovereign working, something that I think many people are totally ignorant of. Most people, when they think eschatologically, think only of Israel. And when we think in the Old Testament, only of Israel. And when we get the New Testament, we'll drop we'll put in the church and other things, but foreign nations, oh yeah, there's the judgment of the nations in Matthew 25. But now let's get on with the eschatological program. We forget that the world's here and God's purposes relate to the whole world. Now, I think that's why we have this.
I've heard that in ancient times, a conquering army would assimilate soldiers from the lands they conquered. So when we look at the Babylonians, we're not looking at an army that sieges Jerusalem that's 100% Babylonian, but that army also represents conquered soldiers from other nations who are part of the team to destroy Jerusalem. So can some of the animosity that Ezekiel expresses towards Gentiles be related to the idea that it's not just Babylonians who are sieging Jerusalem, but the conquered Philistines who are with those forces, or the Ammonites, or the forces from Tyre and Sidon. That there are soldiers from there who are part of the Babylonian team to destroy Jerusalem.
Well, certainly it's true that they had mercenaries within the Assyrian, the Babylonian, and people also, as well as those that were drafted, we can use that term, from conquered nations in the process. But I think the thrust here is specifically upon these nations. I don't think it's just limited. I don't think he's talking about just people, some that could be related, because he's speaking very specifically of the response of the nations. And when we come to chapter 25, when we talk about Ammon, when we talk about Moab, when we talk about Edom, when we talk about Philistia. Those are the four nations that are there in chapter 25. Basically, the accusation is the same for each one. And the accusation is, you have mistreated my people in their hour of need. You've either laughed at them, you've mocked them, you've tried to get spoils from them in the midst of their collapse. You have helped the enemy. You've turned them over to the Babylonians. You have been against my people. You've cursed them. You've maligned them, mocked them, and so forth. And I don't like that. You're cursing my people, and you will receive judgment for that. That's the primary purpose, and that's a national thing on the part of the nations as a whole. So I don't think we can individualize that as far as in individuals that are in a particular army of Babylon. He's not even talking about Babylon. He's talking about these particular nations that have surrounded her and how they have responded to them, and because in some manner they have cursed Israel. And I don't think we can ignore and forget the element of the Abrahamic covenant at this point. So he inserts these here to show his faithfulness to the Abrahamic covenant as well. And we will see that these prophecies, certainly these judgments, should be, to some extent, part of the encouraging statements to the people of Israel that they have. That God is going to be faithful. It isn't going to just be them. I mean, they could go around saying, well, what about, yeah, now we got it. Well, what about all these other guys? I mean, you said if they cursed us, they'll be cursed. And, you're just going to let them off the hook? No. God demonstrates what he says, he will do. We're back to the same principle. God is always faithful. He doesn't change. And so what he has said concerning this, concerning the foreign nations, this will also be true as well. Okay? So I think, again, 24 and 25 are put together as one series of messages and one date because he wants to make sure that tie is there. We don't separate this out, which is what most of us tend to do. And thematically, obviously, Ezekiel has brought all of the foreign judgment together. But this is the manner in which he wants us to know, don't remove this from the relationship with the people of God. Now, I've essentially told you what the message is here at this point, that they're being judged because they have rejoiced some way over the downfall of Judah. They have hoped for personal spoil and gain. They have cursed them and maligned them. They have gleeful taunts on their part. We've already seen that by the part of Ammon. And so that these oracles here should not be a surprise to the people. They did not come as a surprise. They've been predicted even by Jeremiah. You go back and look at Jeremiah, he's predicted all the judgments that would come not only in the latter chapters, but all the way out throughout the book of Jeremiah against them. And the instrument of discipline upon them is going to be, in almost all the cases, the same, Babylon. Okay? And many of these will go into captivity also. We don't think about that as well. We think, 70 years captivity that took place for the people of Judah. Remember when the Persians if you want to get on the other end of this thing, when the captivity is over, and the Persians send them back, and you have the Cyrus cylinder. I don't know if you study anything about the archaeological find of the Cyrus cylinder, which there's several of them that have been found. And we read in Ezra where he gave the decree for the Jews to return. They're just one among many. That was the policy of the Persians for all those people who had been brought into captivity. It wasn't just the Judah. There were many other nations that were brought into captivity by Babylon as well. And they are all free to go back and reestablish the temples to their gods at the same time that Judah will be allowed to go back in the beginning of Ezra, as we see within this cylinder. So many of these nations will experience the captivity in Babylon also for 70 years. Go back and read Jeremiah 25, and he talks about you and the nations, plural, at that point in 25:11. So this judgment also, and many of these, will have its continuation, as is true with Judah. We'll see that there also is future aspects to these judgments, not only at the Babylonian time, but there's future aspects to the judgments upon the nations. Now our pattern for these messages, these short messages in 25, is the same typical prophetic passage of a kind of like a lawsuit. He's going to give an accusation to them. There'll be basically an introduction. He will say what the accusation is, and he will give the verdict about what the judgment will be in that case. So he starts off by first of all saying to Ammon, listen to God's word, not the message of your gods. That's an interesting statement. He's coming to a foreign country now, and he says to them, listen to what God says. He says, hear the word of the sovereign Lord, Adonai Yahweh. This is what Adonai Yahweh says. Because you say, aha, over my sanctuary, when it was desecrated, and over the land of Israel, when it was laid waste, over the people of Judah when they went into exile. There's the accusation. See, what did they do? Well, the aha is a way of a derision and a saying, I told you so type of approach. And he did that concerning the sanctuary which was desecrated, the land that was laid waste, and the people who went into exile. Okay? He says, therefore, I'm going to give you to the people of the east as a possession. Well, we already know who the people of the east are. You've got to get east of Ammon. You're either in the desert or you're over in Babylon, if you go east at that point. Okay? They will set up their camps, pitch their tents among you. They'll eat your fruit and drink your milk. They're going to come in and they're going to take over your land, and they're going to take all of the produce of your land. And I will turn Rabbah, the capital, into a pasture for camels, and Ammon into a resting place for sheep. Then you will know that I am Yahweh. For this is what Adonai Yahweh says, because you've clapped your hands and stamped your feet, rejoicing with all the malice of your heart against the land of Israel. Therefore I will stretch out my hand against you, and give you as plunder to the nations, and I'll cut you off from the nation and exterminate you from the countries. I will destroy you, and you will know that I am Yahweh. It's because of their response to God's people. And the way they have approached them, and the way they've rejoiced in malice in your heart against them. The way they have laughed and mocked them. They will be taken as a possession by Babylon. We commonly call that captivity. Okay? Or the prophecy of Moab. This is what he says here. And he says, because of Moab and Seir, which is interesting because Seir normally refers to Edom. And yet we have a specific prophecy concerning Edom in 12. And that's, of course, been a lot of people call that a late addition to the text. I don't particularly have problems with that at all, because I think he's simply saying what's true of Moab is also true of Edom. And I'll just be more specific when I come to Edom, and there's a reason for that. And by the way, as you think about the foreign nation and you think about and you read and study these judgments, and we're going to see this explicitly in Ezekiel when we come to chapter 35 and the first of 36. Edom is frequently a representative of those who have oppressed Israel. Okay? It represents all the nations. Why? Historically, where is the greatest animosity of the foreigners against Jacob? By Esau. Okay? So, and you even have that even as you come to Malachi and, say, how you have not loved us. And he said, how have you loved us? Well, I've loved you because, I've loved you, but I have hated Esau, Edom. We have to understand love and hate in that situation properly. But there's that animosity and that tension that is going on with Edom all the way along. So the fact that this is, and with respect, to the situation mentioned Seir as well, I don't think becomes a problem. Look at the house of Judah. Well, here's what they have said. Here's what Moab and Seir both said. Look, the house of Judah has become like all the other nations. Therefore, that's all the accusation you have before you come to the therefore, the verdict. They're simply saying, they're mocking Judah. It's become like all the other nations. See, they're no different from anybody else. They're just like all of us. What is going to be the verdict? I'll expose the flank of Moab beginning in its frontier towns, Beth Jeshimoth, Baal Meon, and Kiriathayim. Those are all right down the west side and the northwest corner of Moab, which is a choice part of the land, but the most defensible, because it's straight drop down into the Jordan Valley. Okay, so it's the most defensible part of the land. Nobody would ever think anything would happen there. God loves to do things nobody ever thought would happen. He delights in that. It's just like when he later will take Edom, and he takes, he goes and takes Selah. Where's Selah? Well, it's essentially in the same areas of what you have Petra today. Nobody ever thought you could get there. Okay? Well, God can. God could get anywhere. He didn't have any problems. Well, so this is your great defense. Oh, I'm going to take that one. Okay, I'm going to expose it there, and which is the glory, the best part of the land. And I'll give Moab along with the Ammonites to the people of the east as a possession, so that the Ammonites will not be remembered among the nations. And I will inflict punishment on Moab. Then they will know that I am Yahweh. Haven't got away from the purpose again. Now we're working with foreign nations, and what is the purpose of God's judgment and discipline? That they might know who I am. A witness. That's His purpose. He wants them to know Him. Not just factually, experientially. Okay? He wants to reach the world. Israel didn't do a very good job of that in their vocation. God says, I'll do some in my judgment. The process. Okay? So they're going to captivity also. What about Edom in 12? Well, here's what he says. Because Edom took revenge on the house of Judah and became very guilty by doing so. How they took revenge, we don't know the details of how they took revenge against them. But we know that God says that's what they did. It's a perpetual attitude of vengeance on their part. If we read throughout the Scripture, as I've already implied. And as a result of that, and a result of their vindictive, resentful spirit that characterizes their relations throughout history with Judah, then they're going to join Ammon and Moab. Not only did they join them in degrading Israel, but they're also going to join them in the verdict. And the judgment verdict here is going to be elaborated, as I've already implied, in chapters 35 and 36. But here is the verdict. Okay, I'll stretch out my hand against Edom and kill its men and its animals. I'll lay it waste from Teman to Dedan, and they will fall by the sword, and I will take vengeance on Edom by the hand of my people Israel, and they will deal with Edom in accordance with my anger and my wrath, and they will know my vengeance. Who's the instrument? Yes, we know from Jeremiah it's Babylon. What does this passage tell us? Oh, when did that happen? Good question, huh? Nope. Well, I think if we look at the situation, the instrumentality of Israel is something that does not historically take place in the time of Ezekiel. But other prophets have declared that Israel would possess Edom in the end time. And we have that in later in this book. We have it in Isaiah chapter 11. We have it in Daniel chapter 11. We have it in Amos chapter 9. We have it in Obadiah chapter 8, verse 18. That Israel will possess Edom in the end times. And I think what he's saying here is he's immediately, we know that the Babylon's going to be involved, but he's also he's looking at the concept of judgment, and it's going to be done by Israel at the end time. God will take vengeance on Edom by the hand of my people Israel, and they will deal with Edom in accordance with my anger and my wrath. That's all it says. It doesn't give the details. But it's going to be at the end time. A lot of things are going to happen that we never think about much on these things, and how these people are going to relate to Israel and his working. Though it's just a little, what? How many we got here? We got 3 verses. But we learn new things in 3 verses. Prophecy against Philistia, the 4th one. Philistia, we're going clockwise now around. We start with Ammon, then we come to Moab, then we come to Edom. By the way, if you ever want to keep in mind how you do that geographically, just draw 2 lines out from the bottom and the top and the bottom of the Dead Sea to the east. Okay? Between those 2 is Moab. Below that's Edom, above it it's Ammon. That's a very easy way to do it. If you want to follow the rivers there, then you can get it more accurate. But, if you just want the general perspective, and you're always wondering, where is it? Moab, throughout most of its history, is basically the east side of the Dead Sea. Edom from there down to the Gulf of Aqaba, and Ammon immediately to the north, and then we get into other countries. Okay? So now Philistia. Philistia, we come around and move around to the coastal side on the west of Judah. And they have accused Judah also. Okay? Because the Philistines acted in vengeance and took revenge with malice in their hearts, and with ancient hostility sought to destroy Judah. Well, they've been kind of battle boys, all the way along also. Except this is from the west. Because they've acted in vengeance in this way, and again, it's giving kind of a brief history, but it's implying this still present, because Philistia is still present. He says, here's the verdict, verse 16. I am about to stretch out my hand against the Philistines, and I'll cut off the Kerethites and destroy those remaining along the coast. I will carry out great vengeance on them and punish them in my wrath. Then they will know that I am Yahweh when I take vengeance on them. So, because of their response and their contempt and perpetual enmity to destroy Judah, God's verdict will be that he will cut them off, and he will enact his revenge against them at that time. Now, I had hoped today to get to Tyre, but I guess we have a flat tire. We're not going to make it there, so we'll do that tomorrow. Let me just say some preliminary things about Tyre, first of all. And I want you to think about this overnight. The judgment upon Tyre is chapters 26, 27, and 28. And of course, as you well know, 28's the big boy. That's the one everybody wants to talk about. But don't divorce 28, the latter half of it, from the rest of it. Because first of all, there's a literary structural pattern that I think is important. You have in chapter 26 in the situation on Babylon. You have here what we would actually call a judgment speech. Okay? He's going to give a judgment speech against the city. All of chapter 26. Okay? It's against the city. 27 is a funeral dirge against the city. Okay? When it dies, you give the funeral dirge. 28, 1 to 10, is a judgment speech against the leader of Tyre. Now, I realize the text says prince, but Nagid is more frequently used in translation as a leader than specifically as a prince. And I think it's better, it's more appropriate to say the leader of Tyre. You have a judgment speech. And starting with verse 11, what do we have? A funeral dirge. Interesting pattern. And I say that, think about it. I think it has implications for us in our understanding and our interpretations. He has a definite pattern that he's following. First the city, then the leader in the situation. Okay? This oracle, these oracles against them, as we read in 26, he says this is in the 11th year, in the first day of the month, and we don't know what month. It's the first day of the month. You know the month? No, I don't know the month. So if you will tell me, I'd be glad to know that. Somewhere during 587, 586 BC. Okay, somewhere in there. You know, right up there. Okay, right during the time, around the time of the fall of Jerusalem. As we read the text, I think it would imply, I personally think it implies that the fall has just taken place of Jerusalem, and that Tyre is, this message is being given against Tyre strategically at that point. All right? But we don't know the month. That's why we have to say sometime in that year. Either 587 or 586. When, we don't know the exact date on that. Okay? Historical data with respect to Tyre is extremely sparse. But we do know some things about Tyre, culturally, historically, and about the culture of that time. And we do have some information that I think is strategic and important to us. The entire context of these oracles is future. By future, I don't mean very far future. But we know that what happens with what's described here does not take place at the moment of the speech. Okay? These are about the judgment that is coming upon Tyre, just like we've been hearing messages about the judgment that will come upon Jerusalem. In that sense, they were future and predictive in that case.